Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on wedding contracts and legals. I can see that quite a few of you are in here already. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elise from East Weddings, and with me in the other screen we have Tania from Team. So Tania is here to answer any legal questions that you have. We've also got a few questions to start with. So hopefully everyone can hear us and we're ready to get going. We just a bit of housekeeping in terms of how you can ask questions and how everything can go. So many of you are already using it, but you can see the chat box on your right hand side, and that is where you can add any questions that you have for Tania as well. So I'll be noting those down and writing questions from Tania, so we can do it that way. I've just been told there's a little bit of echo, but hopefully you can hear me. Tania has a much better microphone, so you'll be able to hear it. All right, so first question we will start with, and I will put this in the chat box as well. So Tania, the first question is, with obviously everything that's going on with coronavirus and postponements, etc., will I need to refund deposits?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you to Easy Weddings for putting this on. I think it's a really important activity to take place. We need to keep communicating with each other. So the first question is around providing refunds and returning your deposits, and it really is one of those it depends questions. It does turn on what is in your contract, what's in your terms and conditions. I have seen a lot of different optionality around how this is handled. Some contracts that I have seen are very explicit, saying this deposit is non-refundable for any reason. And if that is the case, then no, you probably don't need to refund. I will caveat that in a moment though, but for now, let's say the starting position is at contract. If you have been clear, no, you don't need to return it. If your contract is silent, or perhaps if you have more of a verbal arrangement or something like that, and you haven't gone into chapter and verse about your payment obligations and return obligations, you're starting to head into a land where the couple may have some broader rights. Now, those rights will depend on why they're asking for the refund. So what I want to very quickly do is discuss the different baskets in which refunds may arise. So the first one is where the couple is simply changing their mind. Okay, so in this current climate, it's not necessarily a great time in which to hold an event. Perhaps a certain loved one can't make it into the country. It may impact numbers, what have you. So they simply want to change their mind either from a cancellation perspective or more likely a postponement perspective. That's group one. Group two is the event is being cancelled because you as a supplier cannot provide your services. Now that may be that you are sick, you are in self-isolation. So let's call that basket number two. The third basket is around the event needing to be cancelled or postponed due to government directives. So this is a little bit of a moving feast. Last Friday it was no events over 500 people. As we sit here now, it's no events inside with more than 100 people, and that amount includes staff, and outside events with 500 people with the appropriate social distancing methodologies put in place. If your event needs to be cancelled because of a government directive, let's call that basket three. So to complicate things, and the law is never easy, I'm sorry, it depends on why the couple is cancelling, and it depends on what is in your contract. Now, an overriding consideration for all of us who provide services or goods to the public, to consumers, is the Australian consumer law. You might know it by its old terms, the Competition and Consumer Act and things like that. essentially what the Australian consumer law says is that all of us who are providing goods and services to the public, to consumers, we need to give warranties and guarantees about that provision of service that we can't get out of. Those warranties around that what you're providing will be fit for purpose, that it will be in accordance with what we've agreed, and that we will supply within a reasonable time. Now, if we are cancelling our own services, the Australian consumer law will likely step in and say that you need to return funds to your client. You need to provide refunds to your customers. You might need to provide replacement services or something. The caveat there is, why is it being cancelled? You do not need to return deposits for client change of mind. You do not need to return deposits if it is an act of government. You simply cannot perform your services anymore because it is unlawful to do so. So it's a little bit of optionality, a little bit of it depends on the circumstances. And of course, if this is a genuine issue that you're facing, I suggest that you do perhaps reach out. There's some public authorities that can help you. So in Victoria, where I am, it might be Consumer Affairs Victoria. You can also obviously pick up the phone to a legal advisor, and I will be continually available to all of you to answer specific questions as well as what we're talking about here today in a more generalised fashion. I hope that sort of answers. I know Elise will relay some of your comments if perhaps I'm not answering exactly what you're after.
Cool, thanks, Tania. Sorry, I popped my echoey mic back on, everyone. Apologies. Next question is, what wording can I use moving forward to protect the deposits I receive as non-refundable?
This is a great question, and this doesn't turn on COVID-19 or the current pandemic situation or anything like that. This is just coming down to good contract management, really. What is vital in all of your terms and conditions and your customer contracts is clarity. Be very, very clear about what your rights are and what your customers' rights are. You need to be explicit about what you will be retaining and in what circumstances. Understand this, just touching on the Australian consumer law again, you can't do anything that's illegal. So you can't say, in no circumstances will you ever get a refund, because if it's your fault that they're cancelling an event, for example, or if you're not going ahead with the event because it's your choice, then they will be entitled to a refund, but subject to those areas. So long as you are clear and your customer has signed an agreement or otherwise agreed to your terms, then you can proceed on that basis. An extra caveat that I will include here is, and we're quickly moving into a land of legal mumbo jumbo, so excuse me for a moment, but there is this legal concept of having a rule against penalties. So you're not allowed to have anything in your contract that's essentially penalises your counterparty for breaking the contract. Retaining a deposit is different. But if you retain your deposit and say, and you know what, we're also going to sting you an extra $1,000 because you're messing us around, that's probably going to be seen as a penalty, and that is against the law. We saw this recently with some of the banks, right? So you wanted to pull your funds and go with a different banking institution, and they charge you some extra fees for no apparent reason. They were seen as penalties, and the banks were ordered to give the money back. So I just say be careful there. Be very clear about you're retaining the deposit for reasons X, Y, and Z. If they agree, you're okay.
Great, thank you, Tania. Sorry, give me a second. Thank you, Tania. I'll get you to repeat the questions if possible as well, Tania, just because my mic is having issues.
Sure.
Another question regarding wording around deposits is it preferable not to call it a deposit, but rather a reservation fee?
So the question that Elise just put to me was around the wording in your contracts and your supply agreements, whether you should call something a deposit or a reservation fee. Look, it's whatever shakes your tree, really. Nothing turns on that wording, so long as you are then explicit in your contract about when you will and will not be required to return that deposit or reservation fee. So a good clause, for example, would say you need to pay us a 10% deposit. That will, from our perspective, that will guarantee you the date that you are trying to lock in. So that's our obligation. That's what we're going to be doing. You will not be entitled to a return of that deposit for change of mind. You may be entitled to move that deposit to a different date if it works with us, and we're happy to work with you on a case-by-case basis. We will return the deposit to you if we need to cancel your reservation for any reason. So really explicit. It doesn't matter what you call it. And again, just make sure that you're being consistent in your wording. So if you're calling it a reservation fee at the start of your document, make sure you continue to call it a reservation fee throughout. Try to be as clear as possible. That would be my recommendation on that one.
Thanks, Tania. And one more about wording. Is there any other contract wording required to protect against such circumstances that are unforeseen?
So the question that's just been posed is there any other contract wording that is recommended to protect about these unforeseen circumstances? Look, there are potentially some other things that you might need to consider, and it does depend a little bit on your particular services that you provide. I'm thinking more around probably caterers and things like that, perhaps, or event venues, reception venues. You might want to have a think about if your input cost is going to increase considerably by virtue of events that are outside of your hands. So all of your staff are stood down because there's a self-isolation thing going on, and so you need to hire, through a labour hire entity, different staff. That comes at a, whatever percentage increase cost to you. How can you recoup that cost from your customer? You might want to include some drafting there saying, the assumptions that your price has been provided on, and that if something occurs outside of those assumptions, that you have the right to sit down with your customer and reopen the price. It is something, that sort of wording is very, very common in different industries. That I support the construction industry, for example, and so you can imagine that a lot of their inputs, if there's a price fluctuation, they try and seek to be kept whole by their customers, their clients. I query here, because you're dealing with consumers with one-off events, I query whether it would be a great relationship building exercise to do that. However, that's for you from a marketing and commercial perspective and an optics perspective. But yes, there are opportunities to include some opportunities there around recouping extra costs that perhaps you might be incurring in these uncertain times.
Thank you again, Tania. Sorry, still getting quite a few questions about deposits and payments here.
Yep.
So when a deposit is returned, how much of that deposit can be retained, for example, an administration fee?
Mm-hmm. Again, depends on the circumstances. So an administration fee, for example, if you've been explicit, let me start with this. If you've been explicit and said that we are entitled to retain your deposit 100%, then you're entitled to retain that. Okay, so that's the starting point if it's been agreed, and if the event hasn't been essentially directed by government to have been cancelled. Going to the question, which is what percentage of a deposit can we retain as an administration fee? It depends on the circumstances. What is a genuine reflection of the cost to you of returning fees, of recouping costs that you may have already expended in anticipation of the work. So let's talk, for example, you've got an event that is occurring in 2 weeks. You may have, if you're a caterer, if you're a cake maker, if you're a florist, if you're a dressmaker, you may have already expended quite considerable amounts. Now, it is reasonable to retain amounts that covers your costs. If, however, a couple is cancelling or postponing an event that is in a year's time, you probably haven't expended too much yet, and so your admin fee, your break fee will be a lot smaller. It will genuinely be the cost of getting, this off your books, essentially. So it depends on the circumstances, depends on your business.
Thank you again, Tania. So just with regards to, you were talking about acts of government before, can you just repeat just a few things that you can or can't do with regard to acts of government?
Sure. So Elise has just passed on a question around acts of government and what we can, and as suppliers, we can and can't do when it comes to an act of government. So at the moment, as it stands, the government has said that no inside events with more than 100 people, including staff, even with those limitations, there are social distancing and different sanitisation requirements. 500 people outside with the same sanitisation and social distancing. If that means, if those restrictions mean that an event necessarily must be cancelled, so you're seeing this with festivals and things, for example, if it is necessarily being cancelled, suppliers aren't being punished, if you will, by being required to return deposits or being required to provide a replacement or refunds, because it is outside of their hands. So the Australian consumer law says that we need to do everything we can to fulfil our contractual obligations, but it does recognise that events can occur that are outside of our hands. That means that we are incapable of providing our services. Now, for the vast majority of us, we are still capable of providing our services. If you're a cake maker, you can still make your cake. It just may not go to as large an event. If you're a celebrant, you can still provide your services. You just need to stand further away from people. I think really the suppliers that we're talking about here who are going to be most impacted by the social distancing and the number of people limitations at the moment are actually going to be reception centres and perhaps restaurants and things like that. They're the ones who are going to be most impacted here because they are prohibited from allowing certain numbers to come into play. When there is another concept at law that essentially says that if it is genuinely impossible to provide your service, so for example, it might be if you're a masseuse, it is genuinely impossible for you to provide your services because there's this social distancing going on. Your contracts may, if you prove that impossibility, your contracts may be severed then and there, and they're terminated then and there, and future payments are not obliged and future service provisions are not obliged. Outside of those circumstances, you're quite limited, unfortunately. And that's why we're seeing the government really scramble over themselves at the moment to try and give these incentives to try and keep business ticking over. We're starting to see the banks come to the party a little bit because, we are left somewhat to our own devices through this.
Thanks, Tania. So a few questions coming in about indoor and outdoor restrictions and social distancing. So I'll start with indoor and outdoor first. Mm-hmm. Can you explain a bit more what classifies as an indoor or outdoor wedding and whether or not a marquee would be included in this?
So the question was what is classified as indoor and what is classified as outdoor, and my short answer is I don't know the specifics, and that's because the government hasn't said what the specifics are. I have it on good authority that the government will be making further announcements today around what that includes, and they might even be going into detail around, square meterage and how many people. I imagine, and to be safe, I imagine that a closed-in marquee would be treated as inside. Anything where, people are restricted by walls, where you might have circulated airflow and things like that. There have been some discrepancies, and it's really interesting that some of the larger reception venues or hotels, if you will, they almost have an exemption whereby it's 100 people per function room or 100 people per floor, but it still includes staff, but those staff are moving between floors. So it is a dog's breakfast, and it really is just one of these. It's got to be a watching brief. If you're unsure, I think that it's probably worthwhile calling some of the and if you can get through, some of the government's hotline numbers around providing information to businesses around this. I say that because now obviously you're on here asking questions, so you're interested and you're looking to do the right thing. The government has, through their government powers, obviously enacted all of this legislation through public health and biosecurity laws. If we are willingly breaking these protocols, willingly ignoring the directions, we could be up for at least $20,000 per person or $250,000, I think, per corporation for breaching. Now, I don't know whether the government will pursue those breaches, but, in times like this, they often do look for some scalps to act as a warning to others. So you're doing the right thing by asking these questions. I'd just say keep an eye on the news today. I think Scott Morrison is due to come out and speak a little bit more about it. I'm also happy to take that question on notice, and I'll be in touch with Elise and the Easy Weddings team, and perhaps we can just issue a little bit of an update when it comes to hand.
Thanks again, Tania. And with regards to social distancing, who could be held responsible for the social distancing? Is it something that celebrants might need to say as part of their legal requirements to conduct a wedding? Or is it something that suppliers are responsible for and could be penalised for instance, a celebrant standing too close, a hair and makeup artist standing too close?
Mm-hmm. All right, so the question that was just put to me there for those that maybe didn't hear was around social distancing, which I really prefer to call physical distancing. Be that as it may, who's responsible? So a celebrant is a celebrant responsible for telling the guests at an event, at a wedding, to social distance? Is a makeup artist responsible? The government has been very clear to say that we're all responsible. I think that it would be good practice for celebrants to remind wedding guests of the requirement. It can be in a light way. It doesn't need to be doom and gloom. Remind them the time we live in. I doubt anyone needs that reminding, but explain to them why, the wedding setup might look a little bit different. I think that it is imperative for reception venues to notify and have some really good housekeeping rules in place around numbers, physical distancing, how you will deal with health and sanitisation issues. I think that not only is it good practice, I think that it will go a long way, that should something occur on your watch, you are seen to have done everything that you can to protect people from a public health perspective. Makeup artists and hairdressers and things, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we've been advised to distance ourselves physically from each other, and yet your job is to be quite tactile and physical with someone. What we've seen, and I heard this just on the grapevine actually, was a directive from government or one of the public health agencies coming out saying to hairdressers, for example, to take temperature tests, both of your staff and your clients, your customers, before the session starts. To use really, really good health and sanitisation practices. So, you know, wash your hands, everyone, and sanitise the surfaces and sanitise all of your tools and things like that. Again, what can you be doing to, not just from an optics perspective, obviously, but from a very practical perspective, to have been trying the very best that you can to meet these guidelines. Now, we are still human beings and we still interact. Obviously, don't shake someone's hand, but if you're then doing their hair, what can you be doing? You're not going to be held liable, I don't think, for just doing your job. But what can you do to mitigate any potential liability that you might have? And it might be, you know what, I checked temperatures. I checked my own temperature. We all had a washing hands session before we started. All of my gear was sanitised, and whatever else that's applicable to your particular circumstances. What can you be doing to prove that you're taking this very seriously?
Thanks again, Tania. And one last one on social distancing as well. What about venues in terms of things like table setup? Are they obligated to set tables up 1.5 metres apart?
Okay, so that question was further on social distancing, physical distancing, and with venues and their obligation to have tables set up the 1.5 metres apart. I would say yes. Yes, you're obligated. So it's probably worthwhile taking a look at whatever the law is and whatever the public health directive is at the time of your particular event that comes up, because this is such a moving feast. And you need to make sure and you need to evidence that you are doing what you can at the time in accordance with the directive as it is live at that moment. So as we sit here and now, yes, it's 1.5 metres.
Thank you again. So just moving on to another topic for some questions that we did have put in advance. Particularly, we'll just jump back into refunds, etc. at the moment, just for a few other questions. With regards to a refund, if you're a cake maker or a caterer, for instance, if a client wants to cancel and get a refund, what are your rights as a business if you've already purchased things such as ingredients or flowers for a florist, for instance?
Okay, so the question there was touching back on refunds and your rights as a supplier to, I guess, refuse a refund in circumstances where you may have already expended money in anticipation of your services going ahead. So you are entitled to not refund monies. Again, sorry, let me preface this. Look at your contract. What does it say? If your contract says you will give a refund, you must give a refund. Okay, so that's the baseline. Let's start there. Let's now assume that either you don't have a contract, it's silent on this issue, or it says that you can decide in your own manner. If you have expended funds reasonably in anticipation of services going ahead, so you have a wedding this weekend and so you have purchased the flowers, you have purchased the flour to make the cake, whatever else it may be, yes, you are entitled to be kept whole for that, because you reasonably spent money on the assumption that the agreement that you had with your customer would go ahead. Now, again, it's going to turn on what's reasonable. So if you have a customer booking a wedding 8 months in advance and you've gone and bought your 10 kilos of flour now, potentially not reasonable to have spent that now. If it's next week, for sure, and you are entitled to be kept whole for that.
Yep. And another one with regards to refunds. How can you deal with couples who potentially might defame you online with a bad review after not receiving a refund if they haven't taken the option to postpone, and could particularly be relevant for people who have cancelled or postponed their weddings before the extra restrictions were put in place?
Yeah. Okay, so the question that was just put to me was what rights, if any, do suppliers, do any of us have about being defamed on social media or another online platform should they not have received a refund, for example, and not have taken up a postponement or a voucher situation or whatever it is that you're offering as a goodwill gesture. This is one of those questions that it doesn't matter if we're in a pandemic situation or otherwise. The law has been really slow to respond on this situation. So the first point is if you are on a particular platform, say Rate My Business or something, and you have elected to join that platform, you will have signed or agreed to terms and conditions that govern your relationship with that platform. Equally, those leaving their reviews will have electronically agreed to comply with terms and conditions for that platform. If you believe that a particular post is not in accordance with the rules of the platform, I suggest that you then approach the platform itself to have the post removed. The second point that I would say is you will have legal rights if it is genuinely an issue of defamation. Now, defamation is very different to how do you address comments that you just don't like, right? So you might have someone saying, you know what, I hired Tania and she doesn't even have a law degree, right? That's defamation because it's untrue and it's affecting my livelihood and my business ventures. If, however, they said, I hired Tania, she gave me the work, but she wanted to charge me this, isn't that a bit of a rip-off? You know, I may not like the comment. I may sit there and go, hang on, you know, that's fair in the circumstances, or I offered you this discount or what have you, but it's not defamation. I just don't like it. There's nothing you can do. All of you are in business and all of you know the importance of online marketing and the optics. In my view, and we're fast moving away from the legal here, your response to a bad review speaks volumes, far more than the original comment. So all of the advice, you know, that you see out there is you respond in a very professional and civil manner. Try not to have your response come across in a personal way. You don't need to air the dirty laundry around, well, I offered you this and you said no and rah, rah, rah. Try and take the conversation offline if you can and build that relationship back with the customer. If they are consistently making comments about you and it is affecting your business, you can try some legal avenues like cease and desist and what have you. You're really depending on their good nature to stop because, as I said, unless there's a legal head of damage, which is some sort of defamation or some sort of misleading conduct or malice, you're pretty much left without many rights, unfortunately.
Okay, I've turned my mic off, so I'll be quick with this because it's still echoing.
Yep.
But a question with regards to fulfilling dates and offering alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
If you have already postponed, if you have offered lots of different options, can you still retain the payment or retain the deposit if a couple still chooses to cancel?
Okay, so the question that was just put to me by Elise was, you have been in a position where you have offered a range of different dates to perhaps move or postpone the event, and the couple elects to cancel and not take you up on the other options, are you entitled to retain the deposit? Again, it depends on what you've agreed to. What does your contract say? So that's the first point, is pull out your contracts, pull out your service terms or your terms and conditions and have a look and see what that says. If it's silent, you're probably starting to move into a situation where what is reasonable in all the circumstances at a consumer law perspective, and understand that the law is skewed towards consumers. Would it be reasonable for them to expect that the payment of a deposit means that it's non-refundable? Probably in the circumstances. I think we all know what the concept of a deposit is. That being said, it'll be a hard argument to fight. It'll be a bad look for your business. So on that one, it might be, are you better to cut your losses? Almost. That being said, it's always, if you're without a contract, or if the contract is silent on a point and you think it's maybe not going to go necessarily your way, I always recommend to clients to sit down with your counterparty, in this case your customer or your client, and have a really open conversation with them and say, you know, we've offered you these things and we're trying to accommodate you, and this cancellation, this change of mind is through no fault of our own, and yes, our contract doesn't address it, but it is reasonable for us to hold the deposit. And you know what, then it's for them to take the next step. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone sort of racing down to a mediation or a VCAT or NCAT or wherever you are to fight over a deposit when the customer has sort of done the wrong thing here. They've changed their mind and they've not been willing to work with you to come up with an alternative. So it's probably a good lesson in do whatever you can to try and accommodate your customers and clients here. Really show signs of goodwill, and that will go a really long way should something really hit the fan and you find yourself sitting across the table from these people having a real fight.
And another one with regards to that as well, what in terms of if a couple does choose to postpone, but you don't actually have that date available?
Right, so the question there is a couple has elected to postpone, but their preferred date is not available. It's, again, have a look at your terms, and I know I'm sounding like a bit of a broken record, but if your contract or your supply terms contemplate postponement, it should include a little bit of a regime about how postponement will work. So, you know, I've seen it before where you come to us with your preferred date. If we can't meet that date, we'll come back to you with 2 or 3 others, and we'll hopefully meet in the middle. If your contract doesn't talk about postponement, you're really just going to be, it's just commercial agreement. You're just going to need to sit down and nut it out with your customer. If you get to a position where you genuinely cannot agree to a new date for whatever reason, and again, you have taken all the steps that you reasonably can to try and accommodate, be it postponements, be it vouchers for different services or what have you, then I doubt that you will be held liable for retaining your deposit, notwithstanding that you may not have a contract that allows you to do so.
And just another one on contracts before we do move on. We are getting a lot of specific questions that we will address later and take on notice. But with regards to agreed in a contract, does this need to be a signed contract, or does it have to have a client just saying they agree?
Yeah. Okay, so the question here is around really contractual law and what amounts to an agreed contract. In a perfect world, you would have your contract in writing and you would have both parties, an authorised person of both parties signing that contract. That's a perfect world. We live in an imperfect world. So, again, the next step down is your agreement is evidenced in writing. So it might be by exchange of emails, for example. So I might write to Elise and say, hey, Elise, I'm happy to do this. I'll do it next Wednesday and here's the cost. How's that sound? She comes back in email, all good to see you then. That is enough to evidence our agreement. The next step down is oral arrangements. Oral arrangements still are legal arrangements, so long as it's clear, so long as you're both over 18, all of those sort of rules, you just start to come into a position where it's harder to prove. So all of the requirements around being in writing is just around proof, that you have evidence of the agreement that has been reached. So if you're, what I would suggest for all of you, if you don't have a clear mechanism by which you get customers or clients to sign up, if it's not a physical contract, and we're moving to a far more online world, you can do e-signatures, do it by way of exchange of emails, but keep all of your documentation. It's really important. And just try to be vigilant on that. And that goes also with your arrangements with your suppliers. Just really, I'm a lawyer and so I'm quite risk averse, but what would you need to do to prove your case at the end of the day? You want to prove, Elise told me this on this date, she said she'd pay me this, I did this in anticipation, therefore I'm owed this. So it doesn't have to be in writing, that's best case scenario, but what proof do you have?
So just back to two more questions back on physical and social distancing. Yeah. You mentioned the tables being 1.5 metres apart, but obviously if there are guests on the same table, is that okay? Would a venue be held liable, for instance?
So the question goes to the social and physical distancing events setting out the tables at 1.5 metres. And perhaps, if I understand the question correctly, guests doing their own thing, right? Would the venue be held liable? Look, I don't think the expectation from government is that we're all running around policing each other, but it is the case of what are you doing to comply. So as a function centre or a hotel or whatever, you know that this distance is required, so you set out the tables that way. You then communicate your expectations with the guests that the social distancing has been put in, the room might look a bit weird, rah, rah, rah. If the guests then go and, they're sitting closer or they're sitting on top of each other, they're high-fiving and shaking hands, you're not expected to police them. You've done what you can. You have set out the room in accordance with directions. You have communicated their public health messaging. That's all that you need to be doing. You're not policing the scenario.
Thank you very much. So moving on to one more bit with regards to this one is if you have knowledge of someone who is self-isolating or should be self-isolating following coming from overseas, for instance, do you have a legal obligation if you're already aware of that and they attend the wedding?
So this question goes to you might have personal knowledge that someone is or should be self-isolating by a directive of law, and they attended an event anyway. I saw here in Victoria, our Premier, Dan Andrews, say recently that, yes, we are, you're not required to police it, right? So again, we're not a nanny state yet. We're not in Big Brother land yet, but there is an expectation from the government that we do keep an eye on each other. So if you know that someone is infected, if that's the right word, or there is a danger of and they should be self-isolating and they're attending an event, there is an argument that you're breaching your common law duty of negligence, of fiduciary duties to take care, to look after each other. It's the same as, you know, if you put other people who are public health concerns into a crowded room and you know that they could cause contamination, we're not allowed to do that, right? So, yeah, it's have the communication, probably let the people who are in charge of that event know, talk to the couple about it, and do what you can. As a supplier, if you're aware that someone is attending that is a risk, I'd probably urge you to consider your employer obligations owed to your staff as well. If you're putting your staff in a situation that you know is dangerous to their health, more dangerous than just the times we live in, unfortunately, you may be found to be negligent there as well.
Yep, thank you for that. We had a question about responsibilities as employers, so that's good to know. Now, coming back to all of this, obviously all of these restrictions, cancellations, contracts, how can you actually talk to couples about this to have those tough conversations and talk about the clauses in existing contracts?
Yeah, so this question's going to a little bit more around the practicality of how do you have these potentially tough discussions with your couple customers. My advice to clients throughout my entire career is just be honest and just be transparent. Try and keep communication as open and free-flowing as possible. What you're running into here is business impacts, and not insignificant business impacts, don't get me wrong. Your client couples are running into an impact too. It's an impact to the most important day of their lives, potentially. So you're both suffering. I think come at it with care and compassion. Sit down and be honest with your couple client and say, look, this is where we're at. This is what we're willing to do to assist you going forward. So it might be, look, we'll postpone. We'll provide a voucher if that's suitable. You know, you might have a cake maker who says, look, all right, I can't make you your wedding cake because the event's been put off, but, you know, it's grandma's 50th wedding anniversary or whatever next week. So can you make that cake instead? Just try and be really flexible and responsive to needs. I don't, probably weird coming from a lawyer, but rarely does it work well to sit down and really get down to it on what your legal rights are and the nitty-gritty in a contract, and, you know, and get all high and mighty on it says this and it says that. If you're there, you're already in a position where you're fighting and the relationship has broken down. So I would suggest do everything that you can before you get to that position.
Thank you. And we're just going to finish up a couple of questions that had come in advance before we go back to some of the other ones that are asked in the webinar. Business insurance. What does our business insurance cover us for? And does that include non-delivery of service due to illness or quarantine?
All right, so this question goes to business insurance and its coverage. Unfortunately, business insurance is probably unlikely to respond in the manner that we all hope. Business interruption insurance generally applies to or attaches to events of business interruption resulting from property damage. So your warehouse might suffer fire damage, your venue might be closed down for whatever reason. It doesn't tend to respond to interruptions caused by staff or externalities. That being said, it's worthwhile calling out your particular policy. If you carry a policy, brush it off and have a look. I would be surprised if the effect of pandemics is covered. I would be surprised if health implications are covered. What you may want to have a look for, though, and again, if you've got particular policies, you can shoot them through, but also have a look for events of disruption caused by an act of government. So we're coming back to this issue of the government has obviously, with the declaration of pandemics and states of emergency and what have you, they have retained to themselves a broad range of rights in telling us how to live our lives. Now, if one of those directives is such that your business is impacted, your policy may address that. I say may, the insurance industry is very good at drafting contracts that mean that you don't get much at all. And we're yet to see this play out because we're so early in the curve of business interruption and making our way through the insurance regime. But I would suggest that it's probably not going to cover you for nearly as much as you expect. In terms of other insurances that you could consider taking a look at, to the extent that you're personally sick and you're a sole trader or you're the sole service provider, you could have a look at through some of your superannuation and your what am I looking for? Sort of suffering illness policies, so to keep you whole. Life insurance policies sometimes have a section where you're taken out of action for a period of time. I'm not sure that COVID-19 would be covered. I wonder if it's more terminal illnesses, but again, probably worthwhile pulling out your policy and having a look. Lastly, to the extent that you have employees, or perhaps you might still be a one-man, one-woman band, but you might be operating through a corporate structure, and so you're essentially an employee to that structure. You should have workers' compensation insurance in place. To the extent that then you as an employee or your employees get sick or need to go into self-isolation, it's probably worth having a poke around there to see what is covered and what is not covered. Yeah. Again, depends on the circumstances, depends on your coverage. The high likelihood is you're not covered for nearly as much as you're hoping.
Thanks, Tania. So I'll move across to some of the questions asked earlier on, particularly for venues. Where do venues stand with regards to asking for rent relief from landlords, for instance?
So that question was around the venues potentially seeking rent relief from landlords. It's a commercial arrangement. So again, you would probably need to be looking at your commercial lease and see what's covered there, or if there is a regime contemplated that you can seek rent relief. I don't believe that yet, and it is a continual moving feast. I don't believe yet that the government has stepped in and said that they will require some sort of rent relief, or that they will stand behind landlords who do provide that rent relief. It's worthwhile having the conversation, right? If you don't ask, you don't get. So maybe be creative in those discussions. Say, look, I'm anticipating a period of 3-6 months of disruption, but the industry in which I work in, we're expecting a real uplift in 2021 or 2022. So I'm willing to sort of do a payback arrangement or something. Be creative, have the conversation. Again, if you do reach agreement, document it well. Okay. Be clear in what's agreed. You don't necessarily need to get lawyers and things involved, but be very clear about your repayment options, your rights. You don't want to have this verbal agreement and then next month receive a letter of default from the landlord because you haven't paid full rent. Then you're down at mediation or a tribunal having an argument about what was or was not agreed. So again, depends on your circumstances. Sorry, guys.
Thanks again. We'll just jump back into a few questions about payments. If is cancelling your own services based on personal worry about the risk enough grounds for keeping a payment or having to return a payment?
So the question goes to where you as a supplier have essentially wanted to cancel your provision of services because of your own concern. No, what you're doing there is you're essentially breaching your contract. You've entered an agreement with your customer that says, I will provide, or my business will provide X services to you on Y date for whatever amount of money. If you are changing your mind, and that's not a directive, you're not self-isolating or something like that, even then it's probably arguable that you're breaching the contract. So you'll have issues at contract law. You'll probably run into issues at under the Australian consumer law as well. So there, as I mentioned earlier, the Australian consumer law implies a whole range of indemnities and warranties and guarantees into all of our contracts. So whether they're written in there or not, they apply, right? And one of them that applies is that if you've entered into a supply agreement for products or services, you are essentially guaranteeing that you'll provide that supply. If you don't, your customer is entitled to a refund, a replacement, a few other little options, and it depends if you're a product or service there. But no, you'll be in breach.
Yeah, and with regards to that, would you then be liable for refunding more than the contract price if you can't deliver on a service due to illness or quarantine, and the customer then has to incur additional expenses to hire someone else, for instance?
So the question there is, so you've elected to terminate your contract or not provide your services due to illness, self-isolation or just personal choice. Your customer then needs to go and find a replacement service provider and they incur further costs. Are you liable for those further costs? It is, look, it's probably one that I would want to take on notice. It would turn on a whole range of issues around timing. So how much lead time did you give your customer or client? Like, if you're meant to be at an event this afternoon, you call them this morning and say, hey, I'm not going to be there. You're probably in a worse position than if you give them a month's notice. There will be an obligation on the customer to mitigate their potential loss or their damage. So they might need to look for a range of quotes. They can't just say, well, you know what, shack down on the corner where I was willing to have my wedding reception said I can't go there, so now I'm going to the Hilton instead. Is that a fair replacement? Probably not. I think it's probably arguable both ways that you may be liable to some degree for the extra costs that are incurred. Again, we'll turn on if you've got a contract and we'll turn on the circumstances of the case. But you know what, I think that one might be something that I'll take on notice and come back to you guys with a little bit more information. Thank you.
So with regards to payments and postponements again, are there different legislations if someone is postponing for 2 months out, for 6 months out, for 12 months out? Are there different ways you can keep deposits or payments? Or is it fair to ask for that payment at the original due date rather than the postponed date?
Okay, so this question is going to, as I understand it, your rights to seek payment for postponed events in accordance with your original timeline or the new postponed event date timeline, if I've got that right. I would probably think what is reasonable in the circumstances is that it moves to the new postponed event timeline. So by way of an example, you have a couple who was going to be having their event in 3 months' time, for example. They've already paid their deposit. They're then meant to make, you know, a 70% payment 10 weeks out from the event with the final payment, you know, paid the day after the event, whatever it is. I don't know that it would be reasonable to say, even though your event has now been postponed by 18 months, that you still need to pay the 70% in 10 weeks' time, because that payment will, I presume, be tied to your need to cover your costs as the event draws closer. So you're a caterer, you get a deposit to essentially tie in the date, you get a part payment on X day so that you can start to buy your inputs, your food, you start to arrange your wait staff or something like that, and then you might have your follow-up payment at or around the time of the event to cover any incidentals. It would not be reasonable to say make that payment now if your event's not for however many months after the fact. But again, we'll turn on the circumstances a little bit.
And just with regards to that as well, if you do have a client who is getting married in, say, 3 months' time, where do businesses stand with payments or with refunds, given that the date is quite far away already, if they then choose to postpone further? Or postpone a second time if this continues on later in the year?
Yeah, so this question's gone to the rights for if you've got an event that's actually a few months away and they're seeking to postpone or perhaps postpone a second time. Again, and you know, here's the broken record. Go to your contract. What does that say about postponement and your rights? Let's assume that it's silent. You're really just coming down to good commercial practice, which is it in your interest to keep this client on your books and keep them happy with you? Presumably the answer is yes. Can you accommodate them to keep moving their date? Now, at the end of, if they're becoming a bit of a nuisance and they're playing games, then you need to commercially make that call. But if it's for genuine fears, or, you know, close family members need to come in from overseas and they can't make it, or what have you, and there's genuine reasons, then I sort of question, why are you looking to rely on your strict legal rights when you should be thinking about how you can keep your customer happy so that they're on your books and not on your competitors' books. That being said, at law you can continue to, there's no legislation or anything to say that you can't commercially agree additional postponements. If you've been cleared that your deposit for a future event or the voucher is for a future event, then that's all fine. On vouchers, what I will say, and this is a really, vouchers are a great way, I think, to make sure that, you know, you're retaining some of the cash flow in your bank balance. You're not returning it, but you're also accommodating the need for your customers to be a little bit more flexible, be it with their wedding, or perhaps they'll use the voucher for a different reason. Be really clear on your terms of your vouchers. So if you're saying that it can only be used for one postponement, be clear about that. If you're saying it has to be used at one time only and they can't sort of bits and pieces it, be clear on that. Who's allowed to use it? When does it have to be used by? Because a voucher is essentially just a mini contract. So again, be really clear about what your terms are for that. If you currently don't have a contract, or and you're agreeing to a postponement and you're concerned that this might just continue on, and you want to put some parameters, agree the parameters with your client. You say, look, you know, in the current circumstances, we understand that you need to move this. We're willing to accommodate you to move it to whenever. This is a sign of goodwill for us. We're here to support you, but understand this is a one-time only postponement. You can do that.
And again, just one more with those postponements and payments. If someone has paid an interim payment X amount of time before their wedding, and then say postponed for another 12 to 18 months, is there a requirement to return that interim payment?
So this question's going to where a client or a customer has made an interim payment but have also postponed their event, and whether you need to return that interim payment. Broken record, check what's in your contract. Let's assume that it's silent on the issue. Again, it's just open for commercial agreement, really. So I would say no, you don't need to return it. You're just agreeing with the customer that you're applying it to their future event. And you know what, it's probably a little bit in their favour too, because we can expect that the cost of events will probably increase between now and whenever their event is postponed to, and you've locked in the prices at today's price. But yeah, it's open for commercial agreement. So you could say, sure, we'll keep the deposit, but here's the interim payment back and you can give it back to us at a future point. But I think you're well placed to say, well, we'll just hold that and we'll apply it to your future event.
And would you suggest that people actually edit their contracts to cover situations like this in the future? Or is it best to just work it out when the time comes, because we don't know what the circumstances are?
Mm-hmm. So this question is going to whether it's advisable to edit your existing contracts to address situations like this that we find ourselves in. You know what? A lot of us are probably going to have a little bit of time on our hands over the next little bit. So what better time to pull out your contracts and say, are they still working for me in the way that they should be? I probably wouldn't necessarily, say put in a COVID-19 provision or anything like that. But, if you're finding that the circumstance is, well, shit, government directions mean that I can't provide my services anymore, and that's an important consideration, you're caught a little bit off guard, then sure, whack it in. There's no downside to putting it in. Use this time, have a poke around on other people's websites. What are they doing? Use the time to brush it off. So often our contracts and our terms and conditions, we just sort of write them up hastily at the first instance, and then we let them collect dust somewhere. Use this time. Is it still working for you? Is it still relevant? Would you want further rights for yourself to be protected against your customers? Absolutely, write them in. If they're willing to agree to them, subject to the Australian consumer law, a contract's a contract. So yeah, I'd say absolutely take the opportunity.
So just a couple more, because we are a little bit over.
Mm-hmm.
So if a client cancels their booking for any reason and the T's and C's state the deposit is non-refundable, if they want to postpone and you can't provide the service, do you still have to refund the full deposit? I think you did touch on this a bit earlier, but just a bit of clarification.
Okay, so if I understand that question correctly, is the customer has paid a deposit, they've wanted to postpone the event, you can't meet the postpone requirements, and so then you, the supplier, want to cancel, is that right?
Well, you're not able to
fulfill the service at that point in time. So what we would be looking at then is each step of that scenario. So scenario one is they've paid the deposit, they want to postpone the event. Do you need to return the deposit? It's expressed to be non-refundable. No, you don't need to. We come to then the point in time for the postponement, and you then want to cancel your services. Do you need to refund the deposit? And it's been expressed to be non-refundable. You probably would need to refund if it's just for you cancelling your own services, and that would be as a consequence of the Australian consumer law, which says that when you've entered an agreement with a consumer, you're essentially guaranteeing that you're going to provide that service. If you fail to provide that service, they're entitled to a refund. So if you can break it down into those two separate steps, hopefully that sort of clarifies it a little.
Thank you. And with regards to deposit policies, are there any restrictions on what is allowed in terms of a percentage deposit to secure a date? for instance, is if someone asks for a 50% deposit policy,
Mm-hmm.
are there any restrictions in terms of raising that to 80% of taking a majority payment as a deposit?
Mm. So the question there is, are there any restrictions around what value of deposit you can require? So the example was if you've got an existing 50% deposit policy and on the back of this or some other example, you're increasing that to an 80% deposit policy. Look, to my knowledge, there's no restriction, right? You can effectively require people to pay completely upfront if you want. If you then fail to provide the services, you need to give it back. You can't just say something's non-refundable and not give it back. But if they've changed their mind, but they've also agreed to this, there has to be a degree of commerciality here. So the law will step in if they think that the consumer is being taken advantage of. If, however, the consumer is very clear about the deposit is this, and if you cancel for change of mind, you lose that deposit, they've agreed to that. Now, if it is, the deposit is 80%, and if I change my mind, you still lose your deposit, no, the law's not going to allow that. But if you're clear, if they knew up front what the deposit value was, when they would lose that deposit, and it's then their action, their change of mind, that means that the event is no longer going ahead or the services are no longer being provided, then yes, the deposit is non-refundable. You can retain it.
Thank you again, Tania. And just lastly, and this is something that we've been advising as well, is should I stop taking orders while all of this is happening?
So the question there is, should you stop taking orders while the effects of COVID-19 are being felt? And no, I think is the answer. I mean, make decisions that are commercially sensible for you, but if people are still willing to live their lives, albeit in a restricted fashion, and you can assist them do that in a way that you are kept healthy and your staff are kept safe, then why not? It might look different, you know. It might be that you have a bride and groom and a celebrant in one room and the videographer and all the guests are through a live hookup. You know, it might look different, but they just want to get married now. Today's a lucky day for them or whatever. Why would you say no to that? And it's still a form of cash flow. In saying that, if you are concerned about your ability to continue to provide your services, then it's probably worthwhile that as you're taking bookings now, new bookings, you be very clear in your contract or in your written communications with your customers or potential customers about the potential impact as a result of COVID-19, what that might look like for you and your services. So if you're a celebrant, you might say, look, I'm still, obviously I'm here, I'm working, I'm able, but should I go into self-isolation, I can't provide the services. You know, you just need to be open and honest, I think, there. But yeah, do whatever you can to keep cash flow ticking over would be my suggestion. It's hopefully this is a short-term impact that we're seeing, and you're all lucky enough to work in an industry that is never going to die completely. Love's not going to die, so do what you can to get through these difficult times.
Perfect. Thank you, Tania. Now we have taken a lot extra of your time, so thank you very much. I can see there are a couple of other questions on there. We'll take those on notice. We'll also be sending out this webinar afterwards, so you can go back through any topics to see if your question has been answered already. But I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much, Tania, for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure. Yeah, chin up and stay healthy and do what you can to get through this. And, you know, we all have to use some of these buzzwords about being agile and pivoting and things. Let's do what we can. Let's be caring and compassionate. And, yeah, we'll get through what we can and see each other on the other side.
Perfect. Thank you, Tania. Thank you everyone for extra questions as well. There will be an email going out later today, which will include the recording of this webinar. It will also have each question when they were asked, so you can go back through, and we'll be giving you a way to ask any further questions of Tania as well. So if you feel like your question hasn't been answered, we're not ignoring you. We'll just put that on notice and we'll get back to you shortly. Thanks everyone. Good luck. Stay safe. Thank you, Tania.